Well, hello everybody. Hi. I'll add my welcome to Janet. I'm Melissa C. I'm a recovered compulsive overeater. I'm in New York, and yeah, I'm really happy to be here tonight. I think, before I kind of jump in and talk about love and tolerance being my code, I always kind of want to start off with a little bit of a qualification. What kind of tells me that I am someone who must have this code, right? I think it's important, especially for those that are new, to have an indication of who I am, why I can speak on this topic. So my experience is I'm a recovered compulsive overeater, and that for all of my life until I had a spiritual awakening, I lived in bondage of food. And whether I was eating it or not eating, I was owned by food. So there were periods of my life where I dieted, where I looked somewhat normal for a moment, but what was in my head nonstop during that time was thoughts about food, thoughts about managing my eating, thoughts about managing my weight. How much food could I get away with? How much food am I eating? It was like it was all consuming. But for the majority of my life, because I was unable to call upon my willpower to keep my eating in check, for the majority of my life, I was morbidly obese as a result of this disease. And I came in and out of the rooms of Overeaters Anonymous. Every time came, I came because of the pain of living with morbid obesity. That was really what always drove me back into the room. And but for a long time, I did not want to entirely surrender to this way of life. I always say, what I wanted was the OA Light program. I wanted to be able to do it my way. I didn't want to let go absolutely. And I think what convinced me is probably the thing that convinces so many people: tremendous pain. That was the great convincer for me that my way did not work. Um, and I always say I'm so incredibly grateful for the people who never watered down the truth, who stood firm, loving, always had their hand out, never made it a moral issue why I was back in the food, but held firm that this is what this program requires. And those people gave me hope, more so than the people who kind of let me do what I wanted and let me believe that that was recovery. And so I finally came back in again, done. I would say done and ready to do business, ready to do whatever it was that was asked of me. And so, I'm going to talk about today love and tolerance, which I have to say is one of my favorite topics. In fact, I love it so much. I actually have it tattooed on my arm. Love and tolerance is my code. Um, and I want to make it clear that while this is like something that really speaks to my heart, um, that my talk tonight is not just going to be Melissa's idea of love and tolerance, right? Because I have my ideas, right? I certainly have my ideas, but the ideas that I'm going to share with you really come straight from the big book, because the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous has an awful lot to say about love and tolerance. And I like to, when I speak, I want to like kind of hold this book up, because this is where I'm hopefully getting my information from, right? And so before I start, because the big book tells me in no uncertain terms that I have to have love and tolerance, and it's pretty specific about the things that I'm going to have tolerance for. I mean, I think this book was so wise, because years before I arrived here, it somehow knew all the things that Melissa C was going to have to tolerate. And it's in there. And so before I start picking out from the big book, the sections that I want us to look at, I want to acknowledge, that this kind of code, this kind of discussion is very different from the way that other people have, the way that other people live. The way that I have to live is very different. And so, if ever for a moment I start drifting into the land, I say there's this land that I tend to drift into. It's the land of this isn't fair. This isn't fair land. And why do I have to be tolerant of this? I need only remind myself that I'm the addict, that I'm the one that uses this book, um, that I came to this conclusion. I came to what conclusion? In step one, I came to the conclusion, I made a crucial diagnosis that I am different, that I am not like other people. I am separate. In fact, the doctor's opinion tells me that I am a distinct entity. It's right there. It says that that's something that sets us apart. That it talks about the allergy of the body, right? That other people don't have this allergy of the body, and that's a pretty bad problem. But that other people who have an allergy can somehow live in agreement with actions that someone who has an allergy has. But I'm a distinct entity, which means that in my own mind, I don't have the capacity to respect my allergy, right? I just don't. And so, right in the doctor's opinion, it says that I'm a distinct entity. And what I always find very helpful, as I tell people, and it's one of my practices, I take a piece of paper and I fold it in half, right? And on one half of the paper are all the people who can eat whatever they want. They could do whatever they want with food. They could eat when they like. They can get ease and comfort from normal amounts of food. They can also get ease and comfort from overeating food, right? Lots of normal people overeat sometimes, and they can tell small lies. They can tell big lies. They, might not be the nicest thing to do, but their very life doesn't depend upon their honesty. They don't have to take inventories. They don't have to make amends. They can get mad. They can hold grudges. And they don't have to develop love and tolerance for the things that disturb them. That's the rest of the world. And then there's me. And I live on that side of the page where I am not like other men. I can't do those things. And because I'm not like other people, I don't have to worry about what seems right for others. Because I know in my step one understanding that the way that I have to live is different. And, I remember when I first started coming into the room, hearing that I was going to have to accept many things that I found upsetting. I remember hearing that early on. Yeah, you're probably going to hear things in your life that you find upsetting. And early on, I learned that my serenity and happiness were directly reliant on how easily I came to accept things that I found upsetting. I was directed to that well known page of the big book. And I had, by the way, back then I hadn't even been interested in the big book, but I remembered that acceptance is the answer, right? On page 417. And acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. When I am disturbed, it is because I find some person, place, or thing, or situation, some fact of my life unacceptable to me. And I can find no serenity until I accept that person, place, thing, or situation as being exactly the way it's supposed to be at this moment. And, I understood this in theory. I still understand this in theory, but somehow actually experiencing this internally was not simple and isn't always simple. This is not like, oh, yeah, I got it. Oh, I'll just easily accept things always. Because accepting things that upset me is one thing on paper. It's one thing to read about it, it's one thing to talk about it. But to really do this, like really have to do this. And then how? How do we do this? Because all the rest of the world seems to thrive and feed on sides, taking sides and arguing their points. And so we see it today. We choose what newspapers to buy. We choose what channels we're going to watch. And for someone like me, I have to be comfortable with people who watch different channels and read different papers, right? I must. Um, you know, I don't, I need to find myself unattached to the outcomes, whatever they may be. And with that in mind, I'm going to define tolerance. And I just think it's such a timely topic. I was so grateful that this is exactly where we're at. One, what does it mean to be tolerant? Well, it's the ability or willingness to tolerate something. In particular, the existence of opinions or behavior that one does not necessarily agree with, right? We don't have to worry about tolerating things we love. It's usually the things that we don't agree with that we have to have tolerance for. And two, the capacity to endure continued subjection to something, perhaps a drug or an environmental condition, without having an adverse reaction. So we have to be able to consistently come into contact with things, maybe, in medical terms or in physical terms, it's a drug, right? Some kind of environmental condition without getting this adverse reaction. And so now, like, let's jump in and get started, and we can create a list of what the big book tells us we're going to need to tolerate. One, tolerant of views that are different. Wow, is that, I mean, talk about timely. And it says, and there's a solution, page 19 through 20, of necessity. There will have to be discussion of matters, medical, psychiatric, social, and religious. We are aware from their very nature, controversial. Nothing would please us so much as to write a book which would contain no basis for contention or argument. We shall do our utmost to achieve that ideal. Most of us sense that real tolerance of other people's shortcomings and viewpoints and a respect for their opinions are attitudes which make us more useful to others. Our very lives as ex problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others and how we may help meet their needs. I'm just going to take a sip. Right. So, part of being tolerant is that we have to stay out of controversy. We have to stay away from controversial subjects. Staying away from medical debates, right? Psychiatric opinions, political discussions with people who have different views. We're not supposed to get into it. And now that doesn't mean that we don't get to have our opinions, right? And we get to have our principles. We get to have our ideals. But these are the ideals that we ask God to help us mold. We ask God to help us in the molding of them. And I can live in agreement with all my ideals. In fact, I must. And God gives me the strength to do this. I can do this and stay away from controversy. And, as a recovered woman, controversy is not my platform. And if I fall short of that, I have to clean it up, right? I've got to clean that up. So I'm supposed to, the book tells me to stay away from hot topics, and it's not so easy when people have views that are different. When family members, I mean, we're talking about a period of time where everybody seems to have differing opinions within our families, within our neighborhoods, within our recovery circles, and so we're not to argue politics with our, I say, I don't argue politics with my mother-in-law or with other family members. And it means that we're kind of told, how can we do this in practical terms? Sometimes I have to stay away from social media. If I find myself getting all worked up in the mix on Facebook and other social media, I'm to with like hold back. let it go. We're not supposed to be argumentative or opinionated. That's what it says here. Because why? My very life depends on it. Very different from other people. My actual survival will depend upon my ability to find love in my heart rather than winning the argument. And so for me, you know, I don't argue politics with family members. And when I do, I apologize. Just like that. Um, I especially, um I have a mother-in-law who sees the world differently. And I've made a point to tell her, I love you so much. I don't want to find myself arguing with you over things like this. I love you. And whenever that conversation comes up, I just tell her I love her. I love you so much. Because that's what it means to have tolerance. I don't argue with colleagues about educational philosophies. I got those too. I don't get into it with my boss or, with my union rep. I'm to steer clear of controversy. And does it mean that we're weak or we're stupid because we don't focus on all the problems that are around us? I say no. I say, in fact, no. I don't believe that it's stupidity or weakness. In fact, what I have found is that it requires extreme discipline and strength to stay out of the argument, stay away from the chatter. I used to think that chocolate cake was tempting. There is nothing more tempting than getting into arguments with people or finding those that take your side and getting all puffed up with your self-righteousness, with my self-righteousness. It's far more tempting these days than chocolate cake, right? To get into the mix. And so, what I found is that I used to worry that my colleagues would think that I was weak or stupid. Like I was concerned about um, my reputation, that they're going to think that I'm weak or that I'm, somehow less than. And if my colleagues think that I'm weak or stupid, that's okay. I say this, I'm a big girl. And I can have tolerance for that. Other people's opinions of me is something that I'm going to have to learn to have tremendous tolerance for. I can, and when I say tolerance, it means that I can feel the discomfort without losing my mind over it. Two, tolerant of varying religious views and even our own, perhaps at times inadequate conceptions of God. And we agnostics, it says this on page 49 to 50. We used to amuse ourselves by cynically dissecting spiritual beliefs and practices when we might have observed that many spiritually minded persons of all races, colors, and creeds were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness, and usefulness, which we should have sought ourselves. Instead, we looked at the human defects of these people and sometimes used their shortcomings as a basis of wholesale condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We missed the reality and the beauty of the forest because we were diverted by the ugliness of some of its trees. We never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. And the appendix, the spiritual experience, says this: most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. He can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerence. So I need to be tolerant of other religious perspectives. I should not look with an eagle eye to find hypocrisy in people and then say, oh, all people of blank religion are like this, right? I'm not supposed to do that. In fact, I need to overlook intolerance in others, not to get judgmental and say they're so intolerant, And so for me, like, family members are great places to start. If I see them as being intolerant, and prejudice, then it's my judgmentalism that's judging them. And my work is to overlook this. Why? So I can see gifts and positive characteristics in others. Because intolerance is an obstacle to finding God. That's what it says. And that the whole purpose of embarking on these steps is to find God, is to find a relationship with God. So if I am intolerant, I am I am saying judging other people is more important for me than forming my own relationship with God. If I am to find God, I need to be willing to see him in all places. And I would say, and in all people. Three, tolerant of being offended. How it works on page 66 through 67 says this. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done. And then it further says in how it works on page 70, if we've been thorough about our personal inventory, we've written down a lot. We have listed and analyzed our resentments. We've begun to comprehend their futility and their fatality. We have commenced to see their terrible destructiveness. We have begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill toward all men, even our enemies, for we look on them as sick people. We have listed the people we have hurt by our conduct and are willing to straighten out the past if we can. So, I was taught by my dear friend to reword, and reframe the sick man's prayer. And that was something that Janet had shared with me, to be the spiritually developing man's prayer. I love that. Spiritually developing. And so I look at the people who disturb me as developing, as works in progress, and I like to think of it as I think about developmentally, developing means like a child, that we're spiritually children, and so are they. And if I can look at the people who I feel, upset with like children, like a toddler, when I can see them in this perspective, I'm far less likely to get angry, and I think about like, I try to think about my own children when they were toddlers and that they did things that if a grown person did, I might get angry, right? Like I remember when my daughter was little, she took a Sharpie marker and like wrote on things, and it wasn't graffiti, it was a child writing with the marker. I didn't like it. I also remember there was a time when she peeled the wallpaper off the wall, and thought she had done something great, and I didn't react like, insanely because she was a toddler and she was developing and she didn't understand, and so when someone disturbs me, my practice is I try to envision them as a toddler, truly like a developing child, you know, not in a way that I'm superior to them, but as like we're all children. We're all, the loving children of a loving God. And so we're developing. And if I can think of them that way, then I can find a pocket of compassion and I can feel myself release the anger and my heart softens. And I try to remind myself, that we're all children of God, just like me. And that at one time, everybody that upsets me at one time was a child. They were all young children who may have been hurt, you know. Hurt people hurt people. That was something that I learned, that a child who's hurt oftentimes grows up and behaves in ways that might be hurtful. And, it's especially effective for me when I find myself upset. I would say, like, there were times when I would get like mad at my husband for something, and I would be like, ah. And then I would think, you know what? I have this picture of him that's been hanging in his mom's house. And he's a little boy with the big gap in his teeth. He's about 7 years old. He's missing teeth. He's got that funny calic. He's in this like, I don't know, like striped kind of leisure suit of the day. So cute and harmless. And, you know, when he says something that annoys me, I can picture him like that, you know. And and then I try to think about other people in those terms that when I think about, because I'm a second grader, if I try to think about the people who upset me as like, one time silly second graders, like learning and making mistakes, I have a lot more compassion and patience for them. And I feel like that is more aligned with the way that God would have me soften my heart and not get worked up, increase my tolerance. Number four, what else do we have to be tolerant? Tolerant of family members' imperfection. And it says this into action on page 83. Yes, there is a long period of reconstruction ahead. We must take the lead. A remorseful mumbling that we are sorry won't fill the bill at all. We ought to sit down with the family and frankly analyze the past as we now see it, being very careful not to criticize them. Their defects may be glaring, but the chances are that our own actions are partly responsible. So we clean house with the family, asking each morning in meditation that our Creator show us the way of patience, tolerance, kindliness, and love. Spiritual life is not a theory. We have to live it. And then it says here, unless one's family expresses a desire to live on spiritual principles, we think we ought not urge them. We should not talk incessantly to them about spiritual matters. They will change in time. Our own behavior will convince them more than our words, right? And then in working with others on page 98, it says this: though his family may be at fault in many respects, he should not be concerned about that. He should concentrate on his own spiritual demonstration. Argument and fault finding are to be avoided like the plague, because it will kill us, right? And then in the chapter to wives on page 118, it says this: your husband knows he owes you more than sobriety. He wants to make good, yet you must not expect too much. His ways of thinking and doing are the habits of years. Patience, tolerance, and understanding are the watchwords. Show him these things in yourself, and they will be reflected back to you from him. Live and let live is the rule. If you both show a willingness to remedy your own defects, there will be little need to criticize each other. So, what does this mean? Well, refrain from criticizing family members, right? Um, if I'm cleaning house with the family, I am not urging them to find their part. That's not my job, right? To tell them to find their part. I don't point out the mess on their side of the street. I don't talk incessantly about spiritual matters, although they might disagree. My family might say, yes, you do. But rather, I try to live it. My actions are what they hear, because nobody wants me to hear about my values if I'm not living them, right? If you're not living your values and you're talking about it, no one's interested. I have to remember, I always say this: my children and my husband, my family members are not my sponsees. They don't have to work this program. I do. I don't have to point out their flaws. I don't have to point out to them, that they have to be fixed. You know, they don't have to find their part. Sometimes my job in developing tolerance is to actually take their side, is to take their part. You know, and I think back to when my daughter was younger. I used to try to make her see her side, to see her part in everything. And that was a harm I did. That was not tolerant. It was, she does not have to work this program. You know, um, and I think, years later, she told me that she felt she couldn't trust me because I always took everyone else's side and I never took hers. And, when she said that, I heard the hurt in her voice, because it hurts to be a kid and feel like your mother doesn't have your back. And so for me, true tolerance means that, sometimes I hear the things that my kids do or my husband does. They share things that they're going through. And I have to tolerate them not having to live this program. Like, so maybe they are making things messier in their own life. I have to tolerate the discomfort I feel when I think that they might experience some more pain. I think that, you know, they're children of God. God's got this. They don't have to work this program of recovery. You know, number five, tolerance for the still sick and suffering. Yep. In working with others, it says this on page 89. Because of your own drinking experience, you can be uniquely useful to other alcoholics. So cooperate, never criticize. To be helpful is our only aim. So obviously, when we come to these rooms, I would say this. I would speak for myself. When I came to this room, I was pretty negative. I don't think I was so easy to like all the time. I don't think I was like the most like, oh yes, I just want to hang out with you and you're so easy to be with and to have friendship and fellowship with. Because I know when I came, I was filled with self-pity. I was like brimming over with reasons why I ought to be able to carry on and cry, to have my way, to make everybody listen to me. I was really sad and I was really negative. I was a very negative person, especially in early abstinence. I was not cheerful and optimistic. That was not my demeanor. You know, I questioned constantly. Early on, I lied by omission. I just wouldn't tell the truth. I ghosted sponsors all the time. If the fellow were to take my demeanor personally back then or been angry by my resistance, that would have added another obstacle to the path of getting home. And if you remember when I said, one of the things that I'm so grateful for was that, yeah, the people who reached out their hand to help me, they didn't change what the directions were. They held the line. They were always kind and loving. And clearly they had tolerance for me. They weren't getting all, oh my God, there she goes again, that girl, carrying on and crying and making a big deal. But I think, that that definitely demonstrates that these were people who had tolerance for me. And so when I'm fortunate to meet a person, and I say fortunate, to meet a person who might need help, I am to be tolerant and loving and not judge them by the same requirements and standards that one might judge a fully healthy person. We're supposed to remember that people's symptoms are disturbing. You know, if somebody came into the room and it was a room where they were supposed to be quiet and they had a sneezing fit, I wouldn't get angry at them because they started sneezing, like, shh, be quiet. You would have some understanding that perhaps the person is sick. And I think we have to have the same sort of way, the same sort of tolerance for people who are early recovery, who are struggling to get well. We're to cut them some slack and show them through our own recovery. Hey, what else can we have tolerance for? Well, number six, unhealthy eating and drinking habits of others. It says this in Working with Others on page 102 to 103. Many of us keep liquor in our homes. We often need it. It says here, it talks about needing it to carry green recruits through a severe hangover. I never handed anybody a chocolate bar to get over compulsive eating. But it says here, some of us still serve it to our friends, provided they're not alcoholic. But some of us think we should not serve liquor to anyone. We never argue this question. We feel that each family, in light of their own circumstances, ought to decide for themselves. We are careful never to show intolerance or hatred of drinking as an institution. Experience shows that such an attitude is not helpful to anyone. Every new alcoholic looks for this spirit among us and and is immensely relieved when he finds we are not witch burners. A spirit of intolerance might repel alcoholics whose lives could have been saved had it not been for such stupidity. We would not even do the cause of temperate drinking any good, for not one drinker in 1,000 like to be told anything about alcohol by one who hates it. So I have to have tolerance of other people's eating behaviors. I am not the anti sugar police. I just want to say that, I know what I don't eat. I know what I can eat and I know what I can't eat. And I know that I can help a sponsee come to some realistic, rigorous, entire abstinent food plans. But I'm not a professional, right? I believe that there's nutritionists. I believe that there are doctors who can also help people. I certainly know enough that I can be useful as well. I'm happy to help people when asked, right? But I'm not the food police. And when I'm with people who are eating, I don't turn up my nose in superiority, whether they're in program or not in program. In fact, I've been at events and holiday dinners, and someone's plate will be piled high, right? And they'll sit next to me and they'll say something to the effect like, "Oh my God, you're always so good. I'm being bad." Like people make those comments about being good versus bad. And I try to lighten it up a bit. I laugh. I usually say, like, okay, let's be clear. You're not being bad. You're not killing someone. Like, you're not murdering anybody. This isn't a moral issue. I'm not being good. I just can't, I just don't eat those foods. You know, they're eating, they're not hurting anybody, right? I might even say to someone, that looks delicious, enjoy it. You know, um, I don't make a face. I don't make like, oh God, oh, I can't eat that. I'm not intolerant of others eating, even if, by the way, even if they seem to have this disease, even more so. In fact, I am more likely to make sure that they don't feel uncomfortable eating in front of me. Why? Because if they really have this disease, being uncomfortable will not keep them from eating it. Right? That's human power. That's judgment and scorn. If judgment and scorn was enough to keep me from eating compulsively, I wouldn't have needed 12 steps, right? I had plenty of judgment and scorn of other people. So if they have this disease and they feel uncomfortable eating in front of me, that doesn't mean that they're going to stop eating compulsively. You know what they're going to do? They're going to stop being near me. They're going to avoid me. They're going to stay away from me. And how can I help someone when they're avoiding being in my company? You know, um, so with people that I love, it's been a work in progress. There are people who are near and dear to my heart who I think may have this problem. They seem to show many of the characteristics of somebody, and I would say, like, what did I do for my children? Oftentimes I get people who are like, oh my God, I think my kid's a compulsive overeater, or I want to help make sure that my child's not a compulsive overeater. And I usually share this with them. My parents adored me. They tried every means possible to help me. I don't believe that human power could have stopped it. I think it's like a train running down the track. Nothing could have gotten in the way except for God. That was it. And so what can I do for that? What can you do for a child who may or may not have this problem? Well, one, I think if you've got young children, and I'll just share for myself, is it can certainly be, an example of good, healthy eating habits. I can certainly supply lots of healthy food in the house, but I also believe that I should not show intolerance for food. I should not make it that they have to hide from me or be dishonest to me about what they eat. I think they should be able to eat whatever they like in my company. I think they should feel loved and cared for, regardless of what they weigh, regardless of what they put in their mouth, just to feel like they're loved, that they're safe. And then live your program of recovery. For me, I never shy to talk about what God has done for me, because in fact, if somebody in my life might need a miracle of their own, they'll have pretty clear, you know, indication of who in their life will speak about a miracle with them, who will live in agreement with these principles. We can be loving and tolerant. And, um, my children love sweets. They always did. You know, and what I did was I bought it. You know, Everybody has the right to decide what they want to do. I have some people in recovery who say, no, I won't buy it. It's really bad food. I think it's horrible. I'm not feeding it to my children. We're told, great. Each family member, in light of their own, can make their own decisions. I don't get in the mix about that, right? I practice love and tolerance. I'll just share with you when my children would overeat of it, and one of them would complain about the other one ate all the blank. Like my son would say, she ate all the cookies, she ate all the whatever. I would say, take it up with your sister. Like, when she would complain about it, I would say, yeah, you might need to speak to your brother to it. I'd get completely out of the way, 100% out of the way. Okay, so number 7, tolerant of sponsees, possible sponsees, struggles, and their questions. In working with others on page 94, it says this: make it clear that he is not under pressure, that he needn't see you again if he doesn't want to. You should not be offended if he wants to call it off, for he has helped you more than you have helped him. If your talk has been sane, quiet, and full of human understanding, you may have perhaps made a friend. And then further it says that he may rebel at the thought of a drastic house cleaning, which requires discussion with other people. Do not contradict such views. And then on 95, it says this: if he thinks he can do the job some other way or prefers some other spiritual approach, encourage him to follow his own conscience. We have no monopoly on God. We merely have an approach with us. But point out that we alcoholics have much in common and that you would like, in any case, to be friendly. So, as we work with others, we cannot be overly sensitive or upset by the difficulties that they encounter in trying to work this program. If I got worked up every time a sponsee or potential sponsee questioned why it was necessary to do something, or if I took it personal every time I lost a sponsee to the food or to a diet scheme, or even to telling me that they're going to work with someone else, right? Um, if I got worked up over that, I would have lost my enthusiasm for sponsoring. And, and we're specifically told here, um, we have to be friendly. So I can be friendly and still refuse to negotiate over the course of action. I don't I don't argue. I don't have to argue. I can be kind. Why should we go beyond just tolerant and loving towards someone who won't work the program, or who decides to do something else? Because remember, to be useful is my only aim. Being useful is my only aim. And I can be useful, perhaps. I say this: why should I be loving? Why should I be, available in the future? Because sometime in the future, you know, somebody might come back. It happens all the time. And I never want to sour a person towards the 12 steps. I never want them to decide, when they get to the point where they have like been beaten, right? I don't want them to say, ugh, those people in OA were so mean. I'm never going back there, right? They're so judgmental. I can't possibly go to them for, you know, or the reason why I would say that we're really clear is that I don't want anyone to think that this doesn't work. So I'm not going to change the course of action either, because if somebody is not willing, I'm not going to, when I say I'm tolerant, it doesn't mean that I'm going to change the directions. It means that I'm tolerant of them walking away, right? Of them saying, no, I'm not going to do this. Um, because if I leave it friendly, then I will be a safe place for them to reach back out. And that's been my experience. I want to say, like, there's a difference between being, a doormat, right? And being a welcome mat. I want to be a welcome mat, not a doormat. Yeah, I was told you leave the porch light on and your welcome mat out for people. Um, I can love a person and set boundaries and guidelines. In fact, if you're a parent, you certainly have experience with that, right? You didn't let your children hopefully run amok and do whatever they wanted, but you didn't stop loving them, right? You didn't stop showing them care. And I think that's the demonstration of what God's way is. I believe that's how God treats me. That he should this is what it's supposed to be, but that he never fails to love me. And I was supposed to try to make my, as much as possible to put myself in the image of that, to try to do what I believe God would do. Be his agent, be his representative. Number 8, love and tolerance as my code, my guiding principle. That's my favorite. Into action on page 84, it says this. This thought brings us to step 10, which suggests we continue to take personal inventory and continue to set right any new mistakes as we go along. We vigorously commence this way of living as we cleaned up the past. We've entered the world of the spirit. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. It's not an overnight matter. It continues for a lifetime. You know, and it further goes on to say that um, we make amends quickly. We resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. Love and tolerance of others is our code. And, so that's my favorite line, right? Love and tolerance of others. It's my code. It's my policy. I live on that side of the page, a distinct entity. I would say it's like it's my SOP, my standard operating procedure. You know, and when you live on a spiritual plane, we're told we live in the fourth dimension, in the world of the spirit. And in the world of the spirit, there's different laws and there's different codes. And in the world of the physical, the code might be fair and unfair, just and unjust, right and wrong. But here I'm told, no, that's not your code, it's love and tolerance. And so I have to have serenity even in calamity. I get serenity even in calamity because I have a relationship with my creator. But, I need to have tolerance of others and to tolerate. And I explain it like this. Tolerance means that I build up my sensitivity to the discomfort I feel when things don't go my way, when other people do things that are different from me. I can think about it like how people build up a tolerance to medication. What does that mean? They don't get as easily affected by it. And that's what I aspire to be, less affected by others and my own discomfort. I have to be extremely, I would say, extremely sensitive. I would say I used to soak up the mood in the room like a sponge. And I can't be like that today. I have to have tolerance. You know, the mood and the habits of everyone else cannot affect me personally. I can be with people who are unhappy about something, and I don't have to absorb it as though it's personal to me. And when I'm disturbed today, I need to call upon my willpower. This is good use of the will to relieve me from thinking about me. As I practice love and tolerance, I am thinking of others. I meditate on love. For me, I meditate on love. And when my mind drifts to my agenda, I can gently redirect my mind to thinking back about others. And I was taught to think of this action like training a puppy to stay. My mind is like a puppy to stay. The puppy wanders off, you pick it up, you put it back where you want it. I pick it up, I put it back on love. It might stay for a minute, it begins to wander off. What do? I pick it back up and I put it back down. And over time, that puppy learns to stay put, right? Um, and so the idea of acceptance is the answer to all my problems, and how acceptance it was so difficult in the beginning. What happens more and more for me is that I can accept others, but I have less tolerance today for when I act in ways that are outside my code. And that I believe is God's will. And with that, I'll pass. Thanks.